As Puerto Rico and Florida prepare for Tropical Storm Dorian, the Trump administration is working to pull millions of dollars from FEMA. NBC News was the first to report that the Department of Homeland Security will reallocate $271 million, $155 million of that specifically coming from FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund. Those funds will instead be used to pay for immigration detention space and temporary hearing locations for asylum seekers who have been forced to wait in Mexico, according to department officials in a letter sent by the agency by a California congresswoman. Back with me to talk about this, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, Shermichael Singleton, and Basil Smikle. So, Vicki, as Puerto Rico prepares for a second big storm in 2 years, what do you make of this plan by the administration to pull FEMA dollars, and just as we're going into hurricane season?
It's tragic from the human perspective of it, but it's also just mind-boggling in terms of policy. Because let's remember, Chris, that during Hurricane Maria, we saw the lives of over 3,000 people being lost. We saw 1.5 million people on the island of Puerto Rico lose power, and it took 11 months for that to be completely restored. So we're seeing an island that was completely battered from every dimension on this, and it's weak in terms of, even though the power has been put back in place, the infrastructure necessary for a long-term solution is not there yet. So those dollars that FEMA would provide for another storm, hopefully it's not a Category 4 or 5, but if it is, have just been pulled out from under the rug of Puerto Rico, going to detention facilities. And as I've argued before, if you really want to curb the issue of immigration, let's talk about the push factors from the countries of origin. And there are smarter ways to deal with the issue of immigration, namely through a more comprehensive immigration reform. So mind-boggling and disheartening, to say the least.
But what does Congress do about it? I mean, we saw, Basil, that the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi lashed out on Twitter saying President Trump's brazen theft of disaster relief funding to pay for an inhumane family incarceration plan is cruel. And on the eve of hurricane season, it's stunningly reckless. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said efforts to separate and jail migrant families is backwards and cruel. Taking these critical funds from disaster preparedness and recovery efforts threatens lives and weakens the government's ability to help Americans in the wake of natural disasters. But clearly, this administration, Basil, doesn't think it will pay a price for this.
No, but it is, in the words that were used earlier, incredibly cruel. Consider that the president keeps saying that he allocated, $92 million when he really only allocated 47, but really gave them 14. So he hasn't even begun to scratch the surface in terms of the relief that the island really needed.
Let's clarify what you're saying. The president tweeted about how he had given all this money, right. $92 million. No, it was not that. Congress actually appropriated, I think, less than half of that. Right. But so far, and this was only, I think, whatever, 12 million has gone. Another big storm heading to Puerto Rico. Wow, will it ever end?
Yeah, those kinds of flippant remarks really are not befitting a president of the United States, particularly when you're dealing with your own citizens, which he does not think people in Puerto Rico are, number one. And number two, one of the things that actually doesn't get noticed as much is that FEMA actually earlier this year tightened restrictions on how they give out money in disasters. So when you combine a lot of the president's rhetoric plus these restrictions that FEMA has put in place and their inability to really get the support to the places that need them, you're looking at the potential for more tragedy for Puerto Rico, and that's incredibly sad and distasteful.
So, Shermichael, what can anybody do about this? If there is a concern that the money is being used inappropriately, if there is concern up and down the coast, along the Gulf Coast, that there is not going to be the money that is needed to, deal with whatever comes, and we don't know what this hurricane season is going to bring. Who does it fall upon? Whose responsibility is this?
Well, I mean, that's an easy answer, Chris. It falls on Congress. I mean, Congress has a check on the executive. That's why we have separations here. Congress holds the purse.
But is Mitch McConnell a check on Donald Trump?
Well, of course he's not. But I think Speaker Pelosi certainly could at least attempt to exercise her power as Speaker through the legal system. But, Chris, I want to talk about this, right? Because I think you know, preparation is very critical as it relates to these types of natural disasters, which is why it baffles me that the administration is redirecting funds away from FEMA, which is the first response. But not only should we be concerned about FEMA, we should also be concerned about HUD, the role that HUD plays in here. HUD has a process called CDBG-DR, Community Development Block Grants Disaster Relief, where HUD actually awarded about $16 billion to various territories and states last year, $8.3 billion of which was supposed to go to Puerto Rico for disaster preparation and prevention. Guess what? The administration is actually delaying those funds because, as they quote, concerns of corruption. So not only will Puerto Rico not have the type of proper response they should get under our laws and policies as it relates to FEMA, they also haven't received funding that would put them in a best position to be prepared for future storms. So this is concerning down the line, and I do hope that Congress does something about this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.